Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged podcast. This is slightly shorter than usual, this episode, because my guest today was under a very tight deadline. It was amazing that she found the time to talk to us because she is incredibly busy. Today, it was a real privilege to meet and chat with her. She's an extraordinary young woman. Lylla Younes is a senior staff writer at Grist. It's really good. It's worth looking up. I read a lot of stories on Grist. So Grist covers climate change, renewables, that whole area, which is where she is now writing regularly and coming up with amazing stories. She used to write for ProPublica, which is these are all non-profits. That's how they're described in the United States, and it's slightly confusing for us. So they are organizations that don't have shareholders and have to have funding, billions of funding from vicious venture capitalists and people like that. They function on the goodwill of their readers and viewers, a bit like Fully Charged up to a point. Up to every point. So in a way, we got that similarity. I'm not really helping explain about Grist because that's one of the things we talk about. So that gets explained a little bit better by Lylla rather than me. And she's a proper journalist. As you will discover in this episode, she's a proper journalist who doesn't jump to crazy conclusions, speculative nonsense. She investigates. She looks at data. She breaks down stories in terms of what's actually happening with using actual measurements of the real world, scientific analysis of things that are going on. She's particularly focused on the chemical industry in the United States and the impacts that has. And it's the same old story, and it's a thing we mention in this, but it is important to really underline that it's absolutely traditional that where people who are poor, people of color will tend to be pushed and end up living is next to large chemical plants, large oil refineries, where the air, the water and the ground is the most toxic and polluted of anywhere in the world. And then somebody complains about having a solar farm in a field, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what happens to that solar farm. It can be smashed to bits in a storm or ignored. It's not going to be a toxic, hideous waste tip. And when people go on about landfill for wind turbine blades, that is like that. Whereas that, much bigger than you can see, is the oil industry's daily destruction of our planet and the chemical industry. And we have to have these things. We need them to create the products that we rely on. It's a dilemma for the human race. And it's a dilemma that Lylla and I discuss in this episode of the Fully Charged Plus podcast. So please do subscribe. So we're getting some amazing people on. We've got lots of episodes coming. So do subscribe to this. And please give us a nice review on whatever podcast download application you utilize for the benefit of this, or if you'll give us a nice review on the YouTubes if you see us on there or whatever. And also, just in case you've come across this podcast by chance and you don't know what else we do, the Fully Charged Show YouTube channel is very, very popular. It's over 1 million subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a week. We cover an enormously wide range of topics and products in the realm of electric ground transport, electric flight, electric shipping, home energy, renewable energy on a big scale, and the transition, both socio-political and technical, the transition away from burning stuff. That's really the gist of what the Fully Charged show's about, and what we're going to go is from the gist to the grist. I can't believe I did that. I'm sorry. I apologize. And we're going to go and talk to Lylla Younes. So Lylla, this is great. Thank you so much for finding the time in your, I know, incredibly busy schedule. When I look at what you produce, I'm not surprised you have a busy schedule. You produce an enormous amount of stuff. I'm really impressed. And I think we've had every flavor of engineer and scientist and battery chemist and automotive people on this show, but I don't think we've ever had a proper journalist
who does investigative journalism. So I think I'm very pleased to have you here. And because one of the battles that we've been fighting on this show for the last now 13 years is, I don't know what you can even call it, just different information that has a lot of money behind it.
Totally.
In both terms of publicity and legal leverage and everything, which is coming from the fossil fuel industry. So I want to stop because I want to talk about the story that you've just written about, but I want to just check if there is such a thing as a fossil fuel lobbying industry. Does that really exist?
Well, sure. I would say that, and I'm sure many would agree with me, the fossil fuel lobby in the United States is very strong. You have, organizations like the American Gas Association and that sort of thing who are, really active, both in, lobbying on Capitol Hill and also in sort of policy making. They are commenting on all of the EPA's, rules that they're putting out, and sort of they're very, very involved. So I would definitely say that the fossil fuel lobby in the United States is definitely very powerful.
Right. Because, I mean, that is one of the things in the background of your story. So it is fascinating that it is such a sort of microcosm of what's happening in a much broader space. So it was Berkeley in California decided to basically encourage everyone in their area to stop burning gas in the future, eventually, somehow. That seemed to be the gist of it, and that got passed. And then what happened? So can you explain how that came about and then what happened as a result of that?
So Berkeley, California was the first city in the country to pass a natural gas ban on new buildings. So all current buildings, if they have gas hookups, that's okay. But any new building that's constructed, they basically, if this ban were to be put in place, would not be able to have gas hookups. So, stoves would have to be electric. And so that ban was put into place, but then it was challenged by the California Restaurant Association. And the argument from that legal suit was, the Restaurant Association saying, hey, listen, this is going to really interfere with restaurants' abilities to just produce some of the basic meals that they do, char grilled meats and, fired woks and that sort of a thing. And so this is going to really negatively impact the industry. And so it went to the Ninth District Court in San Francisco. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. Because a lower court basically dismissed the case, but it was appealed, goes to the higher court, and the higher court actually rules in favor of the Restaurant Association and says that actually a federal law preempts the city's law and essentially that the city's law is illegal. And so that ban has basically been, thrown out by the Court of Appeals. And it has pretty big implications for the state of California. 25, I believe, or over 20 out of 75 California cities could see their bans basically dissolve as a result of this ruling.
So they've also implemented bans. So it's not just Berkeley; it's many cities around.
It's not just Berkeley. Yeah, a lot of other cities followed suit. There are about 99 similar ordinances around the country. I think it's important to note that the ordinances in other states will likely not be as affected as cities in California because they use a different mechanism, a legal mechanism to pass that ban. But it could have, significant implications for California.
But I mean, it is also I can't help hearing the background machinations of the fossil fuel lobby behind the restaurant. Oh my God, they'll come up with a list. They will have had a meeting, come up with a list. What can't we? You can't cook without gas. A char-grilled meat. You can cook char-grilled meat with electricity. You can do it exactly the same. I mean, it is a completely spurious excuse, but it's convincing enough. Obviously, there's enough muscle behind them to convince a judge and they've got the legal muscle to find a loophole, really.
Yes, I'm not really sure how the lobby would have played it in this particular case. I don't know who the California Restaurant Association was in communication with or any of that. I mean, that's all sort of that's not information that I have.
But what is great is that it's just highlighted the difference between my style of communication, i.e. not journalism, and yours. You're not prepared to say something unless you know it. I'm prepared to blurt out any old nonsense. But I'm not a journalist, and I really admire the fact that you are one, and you pulled me up on that, because you're absolutely right. But what I think is not impossible to imagine, that there have been conversations. I don't think that's the most ridiculous assumption, that there will have been conversations and, support, and that would have been done for the most legitimate reasons.
Sure,
in a way.
sure. And I mean, the American Gas Association did speak up after this ruling and, celebrated it. So
Right.
it's certainly the case that, you have these lobbyists were definitely pleased with the result of the circuit appeals court's ruling.
Right, because I mean that your stories cover a wide range of topics, many of which are not particularly relevant to the Fully Charged show, although I've now read quite a few of them. So you used to, I mean, one of the ones that I think was just such an obscure little twist of the global oil industry was the one about the oil tanker that's been left full of oil floating off the Yemen coast of Yemen. But I mean, it's extraordinary that someone's going, I don't know what to do with that. We'll just leave it there. And what's the name of the ship? Is hysterical. What is it? Safe? No, what's it called? Safer.
Yeah, there is a cruel irony to the name of this.
That is so weird.
But it's just another, example of how war just can, throw, oil and gas just becomes this battlefront in and of itself, and used as a sort of political bargaining tool, and put so many people at an even greater risk.
Yeah. But just to leave it, what is amazing is that it's plausible. I suppose in a war situation, weird stuff happens. But the fact that it's been left there for years, it's not like 6 months. I mean, it's
no.
years, isn't it?
Years, many years.
Yeah. And it is full of oil. It's not an empty oil tanker.
It's oil. Recently, I believe there has been movement, and I think finally there's actually a plan to get the oil off the ship. But I'm actually not sure what the state is right now. But I do know that for many, many years, that oil was sitting on a tanker. For those who are not familiar with the situation, sitting on a tanker, abandoned in a tanker that's sort of deteriorating in the Red Sea, which is a super salinic environment, quickly deteriorating, could cause an oil spill 5 times, I believe, the size of Exxon Valdez, and just sort of left there to rot, and the UN kind of unable to do anything about it. So situations like that abound in war.
Right. But then, I mean, on the other one that I was interested in was because it kind of crosses all boundaries, is the chemical company in Louisiana, the chemical plant, because that is something that, rightly, I think, gets criticism about what we kind of deal with, which is electric ground transport and renewable energy. That requires lots of materials, that requires lots of chemistry on an industrial scale taking place. And if that isn't done correctly, it is toxic. It's perfectly reasonable criticism to say, which I hear all the time. It's all right for you with your fancy electric car, but what about the batteries and da da da? And there's certainly elements of that. But that, I don't know what that chemical plant produced, but it's a long and brutal history of pollution.
Yes, Denka. So Denka actually, I don't think that Denka produces anything. So Denka produces neoprene, which is a type of synthetic rubber, and which we all
use. I mean, but it probably is used in automotive,
certainly
in the widest
used
picture.
In certain, probably. I wouldn't be surprised if it was used in certain like cars, in the actual fabric that makes up the seats. It's definitely used by the military. Wetsuits are where you see neoprene the most. But I mean, a lot of these plants in the industrial corridors of the country, they emit really toxic pollution, and they are unfortunately and unsurprisingly, sited near communities of color, low-income communities. And, I think I think one of the things that advocates have been asking for decades really is just for these plants to be operated in a more safe manner. Not necessarily, we understand that we can't just shut down the entire industrial infrastructure of the country is what they would say, but, can we operate these plants in a safer manner? And I think that's what many have been asking for years.
I mean, is that something that I mean, your focus is on? I don't know what your focus is on. It's on lots of things, because you're so prolific. It's incredible. I feel you make me feel very lazy.
Not at all. Your thing also covers quite a range of topics.
We do try to cover a lot of topics, but the other one, which I thought I think there were 3 stories that really caught my eye that you've worked on. The chemical plant, the natural gas ban is the most extraordinary one, really. But the oil coming out of the ground in California. Just to quickly explain, I've spent quite a lot of time in California, and I didn't understand. There's no oil coming out of the ground in the UK. We just don't see it. We don't have any nodding donkeys or anything like that. Our oil's in the North Sea. We've already used it all and spent all the money, and it's all run out. We did that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But the fact that oil can come out of the ground, and when you see, I have seen that, like in the desert in California, there's like sand and a tree and a bush, and then there's some black stuff.
An oil well.
It's just oil. But I mean, that was like naturally seeping out of the ground. I mean, it wasn't at an oil well, obviously. But this was this an oil well where this leak was, or was it just? I couldn't quite understand how the oil came out and flooded the neighborhood.
That story, that was an investigation actually into how, a lot of companies do a really poor job cleaning up their oil and actually profit from just kind of like, the spills that happen. They'll just kind of contain the spill and then sell that oil and then, do a really poor job of actually cleaning it up. But of course, oil is toxic to the earth, to the water. And so, gross corporate negligence really is kind of the topic of that piece.
And also 1.2 billion barrels, was it, or million barrels? I've got to check. I've got to be a proper journalist.
I believe million.
It's 1.2 million. 1.2 million. That's still quite a lot. Yeah, that is extraordinary. So, I mean, and now, do you ever get kickback from the stories you write? I mean, do you get people contacting you and going, why are you saying this? Or you're a crazy radical or whatever? I don't know. I can't.
Sure. We get on some people's nerves. I mean, I think, one of the, we'll often hear from chemical companies or some of the lobbying groups, who maybe won't even necessarily directly address us, but will kind of like publish press releases about the work that we do and kind of argue against it. So I do think that we see that sort of thing sometimes.
Because you're now a contributing editor to Grist, which I'm kind of aware of, but I'm not fully aware. Can you give us a bit of background on what Grist is?
Yeah, so Grist is a nonprofit newsroom. We do investigations, but we also do enterprise and kind of breaking news coverage. So we kind of do a range of things. I was formerly at ProPublica, which is kind of purely investigative, right? So Grist specifically covers climate and the environment, has been around for a very long time, only recently began doing kind of the investigative and the longer features and that sort of thing. So I'm actually a staff writer at Grist. And that's where I've kind of been covering the gas bans and, Exxon's record profits and that sort of thing. Those kind of quicker, more newsy analysis pieces.
Yeah. Because, I mean, it is, it is the most extraordinary thing to witness the painful and forever slower transition away from fossil fuels. And I mean, I'm completely immersed in this whole topic 24 hours a day. I try and do other things sometimes, like sit in my garden and look at a flower rather than think about the oil industry. But I mean, we are asking one of the biggest and most profitable group of companies in the history of humankind. I mean, there's nothing else comes close to the oil industry. We're asking them to stop doing what they're doing.
Right. Yeah.
And can you stop making so much money? I mean, it's an impossible ask.
It's quite a difficult ask in the economic system that we live in. Yes. And, especially at a moment when a lot of these companies are making more money than they ever have before. I wrote a piece about how Exxon last year made more money than any Western oil company ever has, and that other companies, followed suit in kind of scoring record profits. So, this is a moment where oil and gas is really, really more powerful than ever.
Yes.
But definitely, certainly existentially threatened by all this talk of a clean energy transition. So that tension is definitely a really interesting one.
Because presumably that's really come to the fore recently with the Inflation Reduction Act and all the pressure to do all that stuff.
Absolutely.
There was a wonderful quote I saw yesterday, and thankfully I found it. This is in pounds. Great. This is money in British pounds. If you earned £40,000 a day from the day Jesus was born to the present day, you would still not make as much profit as Shell did last year.
Yeah, that checks out. It's just billions and billions of dollars.
Insane, isn't it? £40,000 a day. I could just about scrape by on that, I think,
Right.
if I
You
had
could
that kind of
live
money.
on that. I mean, with some difficulty, sure.
But I mean, what I'm fascinated by is how that splits in terms of public opinion. I mean, do you ever do any work about that? Because I know that America has been kind of quite severely divided in the last sort of 10 years or so. And we have as well here. I mean, it was such a weird year. You had Trump in 2016. We had Brexit. Brexit has now finally come home to roost, and everyone, including the people who were supremely, obsessively supportive of it, who were mates of Trump's, who were rabid right wingers, who said we've got to do Brexit. They have just said it doesn't work,
Interesting.
and it was a mistake.
Oh,
taken
boy.
longer for our lot to go. Oh, that was a bad idea. But it is a shocking. We're in a shocking mess here. But that I wonder if you ever discuss how you might argue the points that you're investigating in Grist. It isn't really Grist's role. I accept that, but whether there is a wider discussion about how do we suggest to people in the gentlest, least confrontational way that it might be a good idea to stop drilling and burning as much.
Well, I mean, if you look at the polls, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think, more than half of Americans in a poll that I recently read are in favor of, more climate policy. I think you are seeing more Americans kind of interested in a clean energy transition. Certainly more, I believe, every year, kind of enduring the hot summers and kind of observing the disasters that are occurring around the world. And I think that whether or not climate change is real is certainly still a question to some, but I think less so than it used to be. And I mean, I think just the very passage of certain climate policies like the Inflation Reduction Act point to the fact that you have more Americans in favor of some of these policies, of the shift. So, I do feel like public opinion is swaying in that direction. But majority of Americans still drive obviously gas powered cars, and I think many feel even like culturally attached to that. I think that's something that's going to take a much longer time to kind of move past. I know that Biden recently passed a new legislation to kind of spur, more EV adoption. It's really an open question about whether or not the country is going to be able to build out that domestic lithium supply chain and actually get us there, and whether consumers will actually, move in that direction. Those are sort of things that remain to be seen.
Yeah. And I mean, it is. I think another interesting shift that the emergence of this technology and these ideas has done is we've sort of woken up and gone, oh, we sent all our manufacturing to China in the 1980s and 90s. Oh dear, and they've got quite good at making stuff. It is a thing that's really affecting this country and Europe in general. The automotive industry, which was huge, and I can remember I worked for a long time in Los Angeles and in the TV industry, and everyone I met who worked in the TV industry in Los Angeles drove a European car. They drove an Audi or a Mercedes or a BMW, and that was the cool, trendy. This is the kind of hipster media dudes and people. They don't anymore. They're all in Teslas. That's got that, and that market collapsed, and those companies panicked. They went, "Oh my god!" They just didn't.
Tesla now. Recently announced that they're opening this massive new lithium plant in Corpus Christi in Texas. And so, that's going to be, I believe, one of the first, if not the first of its kind in the country. So that's kind of the beginnings of a U.S. company actually trying to build out that
to
lithium
make stuff
supply chain. And that's sort of what Biden wanted with that legislation. So, we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Because I mean, we are importing Chinese cars here and you're not. And one of the reasons we're getting a lot of them is because they can't sell them to you. They can't sell them in America because they're not made in America.
Right.
I mean, I think there might be moves afoot to open factories in the US from Chinese
Certainly.
companies.
I believe that's the goal, but I mean, that also takes a huge amount of work and coordination. And so, it's one of those other things that kind of remain to be seen, I guess.
Yeah. So are you allowed to, or can you hint at stories you're working on at the moment, or not necessarily the stories, but the areas, the sort of general?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so I've been covering the chemical industry for a very long time,
Right.
5 years. And so I'm kind of continuing to work on stories about air pollution and kind of disproportionate impacts on different communities. And I really work on a lot of exposure stories, exposure to specific chemicals.
Right.
Kind of like to ask the question of, okay, why do we need the plant that emits this chemical? Is there a way to make this plant safer? Who's impacted by it? So definitely kind of still interested in those types of things, and
Right.
also interested in the clean energy transition and where it's going. What are some of the big, more existential questions that activists and policymakers, stakeholders are having to reckon with? That's something that really, really fascinates me, and something that Grist kind of specializes in. So those are some of the areas that I'm currently interested in working in.
Right. And that, I mean, because the word grist, I first of all when I first saw it, I misread it. And this is my stupidity, not the fault of the title, but I think I read it as grift, as in it's about grifting, and it's about that. But grist, it's grist for the mill. It's the grit in the gears, in a way. Is that more its role?
Right, exactly.
Because I don't know how long it's been going. I mean, I've been aware of it because I see stories from it, and I have done for years. But
yeah, it's been around for a very long time. I believe about 2 decades. So it's been a very long time, but it was quite a different publication prior to about 5 years ago. It was a blog, and one of these early places that was kind of sounding the alarm about climate change. And writing in I guess a more conversational bloggy style. And then we sort of shifted gears about 5 years ago, began doing investigations, longer features, more analytical pieces. And so we've kind of moved in a different direction. I think the Grist that we are today is not necessarily recognizable to the one that we used to be, but it's been around a while.
Yeah, and great stories. Can I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I'd love to know how you got into the position you did. So you presumably, did you study journalism as a student? And
I actually didn't. I studied computer science.
Oh, right. Wow. Okay.
It is quite different. But I entered journalism through the back door of data journalism. So I am a computational journalist in addition to a writer. I use analysis for a lot of my stories, like the Chevron story about the kind of gas pooling in the desert, that story. Other stories I've done in the chemical industry have, their findings were born from data analyses that I worked on with colleagues. And so that's kind of how I got into journalism, just kind of knowing that I was really interested in journalism, but that I also had this computational skill set. So how can I marry these two things? And at Grist, I continue to do that. Another skill set that I built out is spatial analysis, which comes in handy a lot in the environmental work. So
you've got to explain to me what spatial analysis is.
Yeah, sure. So mapping. Oh,
right. Okay.
Right. Mapping the distribution of oil wells or the distribution of refineries, that sort of thing. And their, the distribution of pollution, for example. So really mapping has also been quite an asset. And then decided that I wanted to move away from the kind of pure data space. And so I moved into the staff writing position, but I still use data quite a lot in my work and kind of expect to for a very long time. Yeah.
That's God. I mean, that's terrifyingly impressive. And I should try and do some of that myself, but I'll fail miserably. I don't have this. I don't have that.
Easier than you think. It's not as intimidating. It seems intimidating, but
it is. I mean, what is wonderful is when the joy I have is the opportunity to talk to people like you, or talk to people in the industries that do understand that stuff and try and explain it to me. Occasionally I'll understand it, not always. But that, I mean, is there what is the kind of really big problem? Maybe there's loads of them, but I mean, the notion of us weaning off fossil fuels, and I think it's going to take 100 years. It's not going to happen in the next 10. But to produce the mechanisms and the materials we need to genuinely stop burning fuel. I mean, is there a discussion around?
You said it yourself, right? And a really big problem is how are we going to produce the materials that we need to function as we do? but without oil and gas.
Yeah.
And I think that's the question of our times, right? It's the question of the century is, how are we going to do what we're doing now, but do it green? How are we going to drive our cars, but they're electric? And then how are we going to, get the materials for those cars without further destroying the earth? Because, maybe we're not emitting all of this carbon, but we are, mining is one of the most taxing and, degrading things that you can do to a piece of land. So how are we going to do that? And I think that there are different groups of people trying to answer that question. And some are actually saying that it's actually not possible and that we do need to rethink our way of life. We do need to rethink the sort of GDP constant growth paradigm that our economic system is based off of. Others say, no, we can grow and we can do it greenly and we can, regulate these new industries like the lithium, ion battery supply chain. And we can regulate it to a point where we're not so intensely damaging the earth and we are, creating these new cars. Maybe like instead of taking a wind farm and spreading it over a massive piece of land that you're kind of therefore destroying the biodiversity of for generations, maybe you take it off into the ocean and you offshore wind. So there are so many different scientific innovations that we're seeing come up seemingly every single week. And each of them kind of has a lot of promises and it sort of remains to be seen what will actually come of them. But I think the main question is really just how are we going to do this? And how are we going to do it justly? How are we going to do it fairly? How are we going to do it and not continue to disproportionately burden low-income communities of color as we produce the materials that we need to make a clean energy transition happen? How can we do this justly, right? As the climate movement, so many young people have coined this term, a just transition. What does that look like?
Yeah.
And who are the real players that are going to make that happen? I think those are the questions that fascinate me and that so many of us are kind of working on every day.
Yeah. No, it's great. I mean, that's a very good way to wind everything up because it is that, there is the possibility that we make this enormous effort and we just have another chemical plant near low income people and that makes really cool batteries for your really fast electric car.
Exactly.
We've got
more steel than ever before, but who's going to be living near the new steel mills? That sort of those sorts of questions, right? I mean, it's the green transition is a bit of a funny term because obviously for some people it's really not so green, and so I've personally always loathed the word green. I like the word green, and I like trees. A tree is green. Got a tree outside my house, but a car or a bridge is not green. So we need to make that as with the minimal impact we can. Yes, I mean, so the notion of green cars is just the most annoying bloody thing in the world. Excuse my thing. But anyway, I'll let you go. We've done 30 minutes. You've been brilliant, Lylla. Thank you so much for finding time. It's really good. And hopefully one day we can get you back on again when you've done another really cool story that will catch my eye. Oh, I'd love to.
That's all we've got time for today. That's all Lylla had time for. That was really good. She had to rush off literally as soon as we finished and go and talk to people and do her proper job, proper journalism, not stuff like I do. That's all. I'm going to go and feed the chickens. Please do subscribe to this lovely podcast. We'll be back next week with another amazing guest and discuss more fascinating topics. So, as always, if you have been, thank you for listening.